The oven was already lit. 4 loaves sat cooling on the rack. And Margaret Holt was completely alone in a locked house. She had bolted the door herself the night before. She had the only key. She had slept, certain of that fact, in a cold and empty cottage that had stood vacant for 5 months. So who had baked the bread? That question would not let her go. It would pull her through a locked drawer, a stack of hidden letters, and a love story her own family had spent 40 years trying to erase a story about a woman who vanished, a man turned away at a door, and a choice that took an entire lifetime to make peace with. It started, as these things so often do, with a letter Margaret almost didn't open. Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. 3 weeks earlier, the letter found Margaret on an ordinary Wednesday. She was at her desk, in an office of grey carpet tiles and humming lights. She had worked there 6 years. She had told herself, for most of those 6 years, that she was working her way towards something. Lately, she had stopped being sure what. The envelope was heavier than the usual post, cream-colored. A careful, old-fashioned hand she did not recognize. Inside was a single folded letter from a solicitor's office in a town called Alderbrook, a name she had never once heard, in a county she had barely visited. It informed her that her great-aunt, one Wren Holt, known locally as Wren, had died that spring. It informed her that she, Margaret, was the sole beneficiary of the estate, a cottage, an attached bakery, everything inside it. She read the letter twice at her desk. She read it a third time in the stairwell, telling herself she only wanted the quiet, though really, she did not want anyone to see her face while she worked out what it was doing to her. She had never heard of a great-aunt named Wren, not once, not anywhere in the loose scaffolding of family stories handed down to her over the years. An uncle who had emigrated, yes. A scandalous cousin, yes. A baker aunt with a cottage in Somerset, never. She called her mother that evening. Her mother's memory had become, in recent years, a landscape full of gaps, some days present and some days gone, entirely, like weather. But when Margaret said the name Wren, her mother went very quiet on the line, quiet enough that Margaret thought the call had dropped. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere much younger than her years, her mother said only this: "Oh, Wren. We don't talk about Wren." And then she drifted, as she did now, into a story about a dog they had owned decades ago. And the thread was gone, and Margaret did not have the heart to pull her back to it. 11 days passed before Margaret did anything at all about the letter. She had a life in London that, while not exactly happy, was at least familiar, a flat with 8 months left on the lease, a man named Thomas she had been seeing for 2 years in the comfortable, low-effort way of two people who had each quietly decided this was probably as good as it got. A firm, a view of Grey River between two buildings, if you stood at exactly the right angle by the window. It was Thomas, in the end, who tipped her toward going, not because he encouraged her, exactly, but because when she told him about the letter, laid out on the kitchen counter between them, like a foreign object neither of them knew how to classify, he said, in the mild and reasonable tone he used for most things, "Well, you'll want to sell it, I should think. Somerset's a long way to keep popping down to." And something in the easy certainty of that, the way he had already decided the shape of the thing before she had finished describing it, put a small, hard stone of resistance in her chest that she did not examine too closely at the time, but which she recognized months later as the actual beginning of everything that followed. She took a week from work, telling her manager it was a family matter, which was true in a way that felt both entirely accurate and entirely insufficient. She packed a single case, more from habit than from any real plan, since she told herself the whole time that she was going down to sign some papers and arrange a sale and would be back within days. She left on a Tuesday morning on a train that took her out of the grey sprawl of the city and, by degrees, she barely noticed until they had already happened, into a landscape of hedgerows and low hills and fields, the particular tired gold of late September. Alderbrook did not have its own station. She took a taxi the last stretch, along lanes that narrowed and narrowed, until the car seemed almost to be wearing the hedges as a coat, green and dense and close enough on either side to touch. The village, when it appeared, did so all at once, the lane widening into a high street perhaps 200 yards long, a church with a square Norman tower, a green with a war memorial, and a bench beneath a horse-chestnut tree, already dropping its first conkers into the grass. The taxi driver, a broad, unhurried man named Colin, who seemed to know everyone they passed, and raised a hand to most of them, pulled up outside a low stone building at the far end of the high street, where it bent toward Mill Lane, and said, "Here we are, then. Wren's place." Margaret sat for a moment before getting out, looking at it through the car window. The cottage was built of the pale gold stone common to that part of the country, 2 stories. A slate roof gone soft grey-green with age and moss. Small windows deep set in thick walls. Attached to it, sharing its western wall, was a lower building with a wider door and a bow window. And above the door, in faded gold lettering on a sign so weathered it was more suggestion than statement, the word "Bakery," and beneath it, smaller, "Wren Holt." "Prop, she was well thought of, your aunt," Colin said, as he lifted her case from the boot, apparently reading something in her hesitation. "Whole village came to the funeral. Whole village. Mind. Never seen anything like it, not even for the vicar's wife. And everyone loved the vicar's wife." He set the case down on the pavement and looked at her with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity of someone who had grown up in a place small enough that a stranger was, by definition, interesting. "You'll be family, then?" "Didn't know she had any." "Neither did I," Margaret said, which was truer than she meant it to sound. And Colin, to his credit, did not press further, only nodded as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to say, tipped 2 fingers to his cap, and drove off, leaving her alone on the pavement with her case and the cottage and the low autumn light coming gold and slanted down the length of the high street. The key had come by post along with a covering letter from the solicitor, a Mr. Pargeter, whose office she was to visit the following morning, to sign what he called, with what she would come to recognize as characteristic understatement, one or two small formalities. The key itself was old black iron, heavier in her hand than a key had any obvious reason to be, worn smooth along one edge as though it had spent decades in someone's apron pocket. Rubbing against a hip with every movement, she stood at the cottage door for a long moment before using it, aware of a peculiar reluctance she could not entirely name, a sense that she was about to do something that could not be undone, though what that something was she could not have said. The door opened onto a narrow hallway that smelled, immediately and overwhelmingly, of flour and something warmer beneath it, cinnamon perhaps, or nutmeg, or some combination of spices she could not separate out into their parts. It was not a smell of neglect. It was not the smell, she realized with a small jolt of unease, that an empty house has, the flat, held-breath smell of rooms that have not been lived in for months. It was warm and present and immediate, as though someone had been baking that very morning, though the letter had made it clear that the cottage had stood empty since Wren's death, some 5 months before. She moved through the rooms slowly, one hand trailing along the walls, in the instinctive way of someone orienting themselves in an unfamiliar space. The front room was small and low-beamed, furnished simply with a worn armchair by an empty grate, a bookshelf crowded with volumes that seemed, at a glance, to be a mixture of novels and something else, slim, ledger-like books with no titles on their spines. The kitchen at the back was larger than the front room, dominated by a scrubbed wooden table, and, beyond it, a door that she understood from the letter must lead through to the bakery itself. She did not go through immediately. She stood in the kitchen instead, looking at the table, at the row of copper pans hung along one wall, catching the last of the afternoon light, at a jar of something dark and viscous on the windowsill, with a small handwritten label she could not read from where she stood. There was a stillness to the room that was not quite the stillness of emptiness. She would spend, in the weeks that followed, a great deal of time trying to name the particular quality of that stillness, and would eventually settle, privately, on the word attentive, though it would be some time yet before she trusted the word enough to use it even to herself. She slept that first night in the small back bedroom, in a bed made up with linen that smelled of lavender, and, beneath the lavender, faintly of that same warm spice and flower smell that seemed to live in the walls of the whole cottage. She woke, disoriented, somewhere in the small hours, certain she had heard a sound from below, a soft, rhythmic sound she could not immediately place. She lay still for a long moment, listening, telling herself it was the ordinary settling of an old building, the creak of stone cooling after the day's warmth, and eventually, unconvinced but exhausted, fell back into a heavy and dreamless sleep. She woke properly a little after 7, to a room full of grey, early light, and, more urgently, to the unmistakable smell of bread baking. She lay for a moment in the confusion of half-sleep, the smell so specific and so present that her body responded to it before her mind had caught up. A small, animal comfort settling into her chest before the conscious thought arrived that this was not possible, that the cottage was meant to be empty, that she was, as far as she knew, entirely alone in it. She went down the narrow stairs in her nightclothes, her heart moving faster than the situation, she told herself. Strictly warranted. The kitchen was empty. The smell, if anything, was stronger here, coming clearly now, from beyond the door to the bakery, which stood very slightly ajar, a thin line of warm light showing along its edge. She pushed it open. The bakery was a single long room, low-ceilinged, dominated by a great brick oven built into the far wall, its iron door standing open, a deep orange glow coming from within. In front of the oven stood a long wooden work table, dusted white with flour, and on it, cooling on wire racks, stood 4 loaves of bread, their crusts a deep, even brown, steam still rising faintly from them into the cool morning air. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, entirely unable to make sense of what she was looking at. The oven was lit, the bread was baked, and there was, as far as she could see in the grey morning light filtering through the bow window at the front of the shop, no one else in the room at all. She checked the back door, which was locked from the inside, the bolt drawn across. She checked the front door of the shop itself, also locked, the open sign still turned to closed where it hung in the window. She stood in the middle of the room, in her nightclothes, with 4 loaves of bread cooling in front of her that she had not baked, in an oven she had not lit, in a locked building, and felt the particular vertigo of a fact that refused to organize itself into any explanation she could accept. She did, eventually, what anyone in her position might have done, which was to decide, provisionally and without much confidence, that there must be some rational explanation she was simply not yet equipped to see. A timer, perhaps, some mechanism left running from before Wren's death, a neighbor with a spare key, arriving early and departing before she woke, for reasons of their own. She did not, in that first grey morning, allow herself to consider the alternative, which hovered at the edge of her thoughts like something glimpsed from the corner of the eye, gone the moment she turned to look at it directly. She ate a slice of the bread, in the end, standing at the work table in the thin morning light, because it seemed, somehow, wasteful, and even faintly rude, not to, and because the smell of it had settled so deeply and so pleasantly into her that resistance felt like more effort than it was worth. It was, she would think many times in the weeks that followed, without doubt the best bread she had ever eaten, dense and faintly sweet, with a flavor she could not place, something herbal and warm beneath the ordinary taste of good bread, something that reminded her, in a way she could not account for, of a smell from very early childhood that she had no specific memory attached to at all, only a feeling, warm and safe and long since buried. She met Mr. Pargeter at 11, in an office above the ironmonger's on the High Street, a room of dark wood and stacked files that smelled of dust and old paper. He was an elderly man, precise in his movements, who peered at her over half-moon glasses with an expression she found difficult to read. Something between professional courtesy and a private curiosity he was too well-mannered to voice directly. "You'll forgive me," he said, once the necessary papers had been signed and witnessed, "if I say you have something of her look about you. Not that I knew you were coming, of course, or that I'd have known to look, but there it is, around the eyes, I should say. I never met her, Margaret said. "I didn't know she existed until the letter came." Mr. Pargeter's expression shifted slightly at that. Something that might have been surprise, settling briefly into the careful neutrality of his face. "Is that so?" he said, in the tone of a man filing away a fact for later consideration. "Well, she kept herself somewhat apart. Your great aunt, not unfriendly. You understand, the whole village thought the world of her. And I don't say that lightly, but apart, in her own way. There were things she didn't speak of, family things. I always understood, though she never said as much directly, and I never asked. It wasn't my place." "Do you know why?" Margaret asked. There was a rift. "My mother said we don't talk about Wren. That was the whole explanation I got. I couldn't say," Mr. Pargeter said. And Margaret had the distinct sense, watching his face, that this was not entirely true, or at least not entirely the whole of it, though she did not press him further, sensing that whatever discretion held him would not be moved by pressing. "I handled her affairs for the better part of 30 years, and in all that time she mentioned her family perhaps twice, and both times only to say that there was no family to speak of. I confess I was as surprised as anyone when her will named you. She must have kept track of you, somehow, over the years, though how, I couldn't say." He passed her, before she left, a small bundle of additional keys to the shop's front door, to a shed behind the cottage, to what he described, with a slight and unreadable pause, as the drawer under the flower bin, which she was always particular about, though I never knew why, and a folded piece of paper on which was written, in the same careful hand as the letter that had first summoned her, a short list of names. "Mrs. Abernathy, at the shop. Tom Bellamy, deliveries. Fenella, next door. Ask them anything." They knew her better than I did. Margaret spent that first full day walking the village in the mild September light, partly from a genuine desire to understand where she had landed, and partly, she admitted to herself only reluctantly, because she was not yet ready to go back into the cottage and sit alone with the accumulating strangeness of it. Alderbrook was smaller than it had first appeared from the taxi window. A single high street bending around the green, a scattering of lanes leading off toward farms, and, at the western edge of the village, a slow brown river that gave the mill, long since converted to a private house, its name. She found the shop that Mr. Pargeter's list had mentioned, a general store 2 doors down from the bakery, and introduced herself to the woman behind the counter, who turned out to be Mrs. Abernathy, a round, brisk woman somewhere in her 60s with sharp, kind eyes that assessed Margaret thoroughly in the first few seconds of their meeting. "You're the niece, then," Mrs. Abernathy said, before Margaret had gotten further than her name. "Word travels fast in a place this size, love. You'll learn that soon enough. We wondered if anyone would come." Wren never spoke of family. Not once in the 30 years I knew her, and I'll admit we all assumed there wasn't any to speak of. She paused, studying Margaret's face with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable if it hadn't been so evidently warm underneath. "You've a look of her, you know, not the coloring, but something in how you're standing there, like you're not sure whether you're allowed to be here." She stood like that too, when she first came. "When she first came?" Margaret repeated. "She wasn't born here then?" "Lord, no. Came from away, same as you, though that's 40 years back now, more. Bought the cottage, and the bakery from old Mr. Trent when he retired, and never said a word about where she'd come from before that. And nobody asked, not after the first year or two, when it became clear she didn't care to say. "We're not a nosy village, Mrs. Abernathy added, with a small, self-aware smile that suggested she knew perfectly well this was not entirely true, though we do like to know our own, in the end, and she became our own, whatever she'd been before. Best baker this county's ever had, and I don't say that to be kind. People used to drive from Bath for her bread. Some still do. Though I don't know what they'll do now," Margaret asked, carefully, whether Mrs. Abernathy knew anything about a rift with the family Wren had left behind, and watched the older woman's face grow thoughtful, the brisk cheerfulness settling into something more careful. She never said, not directly, but there was a sadness in her, under all the warmth, that never quite left, not in all the years I knew her, and once, only once, mind, and she'd had a glass more sherry than was usual for her at old Fenella's Christmas do some years back. She said something about having given something up to come here. Not what. Just that she'd given something up, and that some people never forgave her for it, and that she'd made her peace with that a long time ago, though I don't know that peace is quite the word I'd have chosen. Watching her face when she said it, Margaret thanked her and walked on, the fragments of information settling uneasily against each other in her mind, a shape she could almost but not quite see. She met, over the course of that first day, several more of the names on Mr. Pargeter's list. Tom Bellamy, a weathered, cheerful man who had driven the delivery van for Wren for over 20 years, and who spoke of her with an unguarded affection that made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly. And Fenella, an elderly woman living in the cottage next door, who invited Margaret in for tea with an easy hospitality that suggested she had been half expecting this visit for some time. Fenella's cottage was small and cluttered in the comfortable way of a house lived in for many decades, every surface holding some small collection of objects, china figures, pressed flowers under glass, photographs in frames of every shape and era. She made tea in a brown pot with a chip in its spout and set out a plate of biscuits that she said, with evident pride, Wren had taught her to make some 15 years before. "She was the best friend I ever had," Fenella said, settling into a chair by the window with the particular slow care of a woman for whom every movement required a small negotiation with age. 40 years we knew each other. More than 40, now I think on it. And do you know, in all that time, I never once saw where she came from. Never met a soul from her old life. Never had a letter from anyone that I saw, except she paused, and something in her face shifted, a private recollection surfacing. Except there was a man, once. Years and years ago, this would have been not long after she first came. He came to the village, asking after her. Fine-looking man, well-dressed, not from round here. She wouldn't see him. Sent word through Mr. Trent, who had the bakery before her, that she wasn't at home, though we all knew she was, because the light was on in the kitchen the whole time he waited outside. "Do you know who he was?" Margaret asked, aware that her voice had gone quieter than she meant it to. "No," Fenella said. "She never spoke of him afterward, and I never asked, because it was plain from her face when I saw her the next day that it wasn't a thing she wanted spoken of. But I've thought of him now and again, over the years, wondered what became of him, wondered why a woman with a face as kind as Wren's would turn a man away at her own door without so much as a word, unless there was something behind it that went a good deal deeper than an ordinary quarrel. She looked at Margaret over the rim of her teacup, her eyes sharp despite their age. "You've the look of someone carrying a question, my dear. I hope you find your answer." She was not a woman who did things without reason. Whatever those reasons were, if she wanted you to have that cottage, she wanted you to have whatever's in it too, I should think. All of it. Margaret walked back to the cottage as the light began its long amber slide toward evening. The words, all of it, settling into her chest with a weight she did not fully understand yet, though she would come in the days ahead to understand it very well indeed. The high street was quiet, shops closing, a few villagers nodding to her now, with the particular recognition of people who had already, in the space of a single day, absorbed her into the loose fabric of who belonged and who did not. She let herself in through the cottage's front door and stood for a moment in the hallway, breathing in the warm, spiced smell that seemed to live permanently in the walls, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not, after all, in any great hurry to arrange a sale. She did not sleep well that second night, not from any particular fear, but from a restlessness that kept her mind turning over the day's fragments, the bread that had baked itself, the man turned away at the door, the sadness Mrs. Abernathy had described beneath Wren's warmth, the shape of a story she could almost see the edges of, but not yet the center. She rose before dawn, unable to settle, and went down to the kitchen, meaning only to make tea, and found, again, the bakery door standing very slightly ajar, and beyond it, the oven glowing, and 3 loaves, this time smaller, cooling on the rack, and a 4th still rising, covered with a cloth, in a wooden proofing box. She did not remember having been there the evening before. She stood in the doorway for a long time, this time, not frightened exactly, though her pulse had quickened, but held by something closer to a held breath, a sense of standing at the edge of an understanding she was not quite ready to step into. She thought of the word Fenella had used reason, and of Mrs. Abernathy's description of a sadness under the warmth, and of the way the whole cottage seemed to hold itself, not empty, not haunted in any way that frightened her, but tended, as though someone had left instructions for its own continued care that it was, in some manner she could not begin to explain, still faithfully carrying out. She did not touch the rising loaf. She made her tea and sat at the kitchen table with the door to the bakery left open, and watched the grey morning light slowly become gold, and allowed herself, for the first time since the letter had arrived 11 days before, to simply sit with the strangeness of it all, rather than trying immediately to explain it away, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that this felt less like fear than it felt like being, in some manner she could not have described to anyone else, expected. It was on the 3rd day that she found the drawer. She had spent the morning in the shop itself, taking a proper inventory at Mr. Pargeter's gentle suggestion, moving along the shelves and cupboards with a notebook, cataloguing tins of spices with labels in Wren's careful hand, jars of preserved fruit, a wall of copper molds in shapes she did not recognize, birds and sheaves of wheat, and one, oddly in the shape of a small house with a single chimney. She had reached the long work table, beneath which ran a row of deep wooden drawers, most containing the ordinary tools of a working bakery: rolling pins, scoring blades, a set of brass weights worn smooth with decades of handling. When she came to the last drawer in the row, set slightly apart from the others, and found it locked, she thought immediately of Mr. Pargetter's small, unreadable paws. The drawer under the flour bin, which she was always particular about, though I never knew why. She fetched the bundle of keys he had given her, and found, among the ordinary iron keys to doors and sheds, one smaller and finer than the rest, brass rather than iron, that fit the lock with a soft, satisfying click that seemed to echo in the quiet of the empty shop. Inside the drawer, wrapped in a square of linen gone soft and yellow with age, was a stack of small books, perhaps a dozen of them, bound in plain cloth covers of varying colors, none of them titled on their spines. Beneath the books, wrapped separately in wax paper and tied with kitchen string, were what appeared to be loaves of bread, or what had once been loaves of bread, now dry and hard with age, each parcel labeled in the same careful hand as everything else in the cottage, not with a recipe or a date alone, but with a name and a year. Eleanor, 1971. Old Mr. Trent, 1979. A name Margaret did not recognize. Cassian, followed by a year some 4 decades past. And then, in smaller writing beneath it, a single word: forgiven. Margaret sat back on her heels in front of the open drawer for a long moment, the linen wrapping loose in her hands, and felt the particular vertigo of standing very close to the center of something she had only glimpsed the edges of until now. She lifted the topmost of the small cloth-bound books and opened it, and found, on the first page, in Wren's hand, not a recipe at all, but the beginning of what appeared to be a story, a fiction, or something styled as one, about a woman and a garden and a house that seemed, in ways the story did not explain, to know things about the people who lived in it. She read the first few pages standing there in the quiet shop, the autumn light coming soft and gold through the bow window, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not yet have words for, a recognition without content, the sense of hearing the first notes of a song whose ending she somehow already knew, though she could not have said how. She closed the book carefully, wrapped it back in its linen with the others, and sat for a long while on the floor of the bakery, with the open drawer in front of her, the parcelled loaves and their labelled names, the small unread books, and the low autumn sun moving slowly across the flour-dusted boards, thinking of the man Fenella had described, turned away at the door with the kitchen light burning behind him, and of the word forgiven written beneath a stranger's name, and of her own mother's voice on the telephone saying, "We don't talk about Wren," and understanding for the first time that there was a great deal more to be found in this cottage than she had ever imagined when she had signed her name to Mr. Pargetter's papers 3 days before. She did not read further that day. She wrapped the books back in their linen and returned the parcelled loaves to their places, and locked the drawer again, though she kept the small brass key on its own separate ring after that, carrying it in her pocket the way. She thought, without quite meaning to, that Wren must once have carried it in the pocket of her own apron. That evening, she wrote to Thomas, a short message explaining that the matter would take longer to settle than she had expected, that there were things about the estate that needed sorting through properly before any decision about selling could sensibly be made. His reply came within the hour, mildly surprised, mildly put out in the careful, reasonable way he expressed most forms of displeasure, suggesting that surely a solicitor could handle most of this without her needing to stay on herself. She looked at the message for a long time before answering, aware of a small, hard clarity settling into her that had not been there 11 days before, and wrote back only that she thought it best to see it through properly herself, and that she would let him know when she had a clearer sense of timing. She did not, in the days that followed, think very much about Thomas at all, which she noted with a distant and not unpleasant surprise, as itself a kind of answer to a question she had not yet consciously asked. The days settled, over the following week, into a rhythm she had not chosen so much as simply found herself inside of. She woke early, before the light had properly come, and went down to find the oven already lit, the night's baking cooling on its racks. And she began, without quite deciding to help sweeping the flour-dusted floor, setting the cooled loaves onto the shelves in the front of the shop, opening the door at 8, as the hand-lettered sign in the window had always instructed, though she had no memory of turning the sign herself, and found it, each morning, already reading open when she came down. The village received this arrangement with a warmth that surprised her. Mrs. Abernathy sent custom her way, telling anyone who asked that the niece was minding the bakery for now, and folk began to appear at the door in the soft early mornings the way she gathered from their easy familiarity. They always had, asking for the same loaves by name, a cottage loaf for the Prossers, a dark rye for the man who kept bees at the edge of the village, a small sweet bun studded with currants that 3 different children asked for by a name Margaret did not know, a Wren bun, one small girl told her solemnly, because Wren always gave you an extra currant if you asked nicely. And did Margaret know how to do the extra currant too? Margaret did not, in those first days, know how to do very much at all, beyond what her hands seemed to remember without her mind's full participation. A strange and disorienting sensation she noticed most acutely in the mornings when she found herself reaching for a particular bowl, a particular measure, before she had consciously decided to need it, as though some current beneath her ordinary thoughts already knew the shape of the work, even though she herself had never baked so much as a loaf of bread in her adult life. She said as much to Fenella one afternoon, over tea, expecting perhaps to be told this was simply nerves, or habit quickly learned, and instead watched the old woman's face grow thoughtful and still. She used to say, Fenella said slowly, that the bakery remembered things, not just recipes, hands. She said her own hands had learned things from someone before her, though she never said who, and I never pressed. The way I never pressed about most things with Wren. I wonder now if she meant something rather more literal than I understood at the time. She looked at Margaret for a long moment, her sharp old eyes unusually gentle. You're not frightened, are you, my dear, of any of this? Margaret considered the question honestly before answering. She said, and found, as she said it, that it was entirely true. I don't know what to call it, but I'm not frightened. Good, Fenella said. She wouldn't have wanted you frightened, whatever else she was, and I loved her dearly for 40 years without ever knowing the whole of her. She was not a woman who wished anyone ill. I've thought about it a great deal since the funeral, about what sort of woman leaves her whole life to a niece she's apparently never met. And I've come to think it was not a stranger's gift at all. I think she had been watching you, in whatever way a woman like that watches, for longer than either of you knew. That night, unable to settle, Margaret took the small brass key from her pocket and went down to the bakery in the dark. the oven cold now, the last of the day's warmth gone from the room, and unlocked the drawer beneath the work table, and lifted out the second of the small cloth-bound books, and carried it, along with a candle from the kitchen dresser, to the worn armchair in the front room, and began, properly this time, to read. The story in the second book was different from the first, though it shared its strange, half-fictional quality and account, styled as a tale but carrying, in its details, a weight and specificity that felt too precise to be pure invention, of a young woman who leaves a grand and unhappy house to seek work in a village bakery, and who discovers, over the course of the telling, that the trade she has taken up almost by accident has begun, slowly, to heal something in her that she had not known was broken. The woman in the story was never named. The village was never named. But there were details, a particular bend in a lane, a church with a square tower, a bench beneath a horse chestnut tree that Margaret recognized, with a small shock each time, as belonging unmistakably to Alderbrook itself. She read until the candle had burned low, and set the book aside at last, with the strange, settled feeling of having overheard something private and true, a confession disguised, for whatever reason, as a story, and thought again of the man turned away at the door, and the word forgiven written under a stranger's name, and understood with a growing and not unpleasant certainty that there was a whole life folded into this cottage, wrapped in linen and locked in a drawer, that she had only just begun to unfold. She woke the next morning to find, on the kitchen table where she had certainly not left it, a single loaf of bread still faintly warm, and beside it, propped against the sugar bowl, a small folded card in handwriting she now recognized, without needing to be told, though the message it carried was only 3 words long, plain and without explanation. Keep reading, love. Margaret sat very still at the table for a long time, the warm loaf between her hands, the small card propped where she could see it, and felt, for the first time since the letter had first found her 11 days before, on an ordinary Wednesday in London, not disoriented, not uncertain, but something closer to accompanied, as though the distance between herself and a woman she had never met, and would now never meet, had grown, without her quite noticing when, considerably smaller than it had been. She finished her tea, she dressed, she opened the shop at 8, as she always did now. The sign already turned when she came down, and set about the day's small familiar tasks with hands that seemed, more and more each morning, to already know their way. But that evening, once the shop was closed and the light had gone gold and then grey over the high street, she went back to the drawer beneath the work table and lifted out the next of the small books and read on, into the second week of her stay in Alderbrook, into a story that was slowly and with great patience telling her who her great-aunt had been, and why she had been sent away, and what, exactly, she had given up to come to this village and this bakery, and, though she could not have known it at the time, to leave, 4 decades later, a whole quiet life folded carefully into linen for a niece she had never met, but had, it was becoming clearer with every page, never for a single year truly forgotten. The third of the small books took her deeper into the story than either of the first 2 had done, and it was here, On a Thursday evening, with rain beginning to tap softly against the bow window of the shop, that Margaret first understood the shape of what she was reading was not in fact entirely a story at all. The account, still styled in that same careful, half-fictional voice, described a house far grander than anything Margaret had imagined. From the earlier pages, a manor of grey stone somewhere in the north, with long corridors and cold rooms, and a family whose wealth had, by the telling, long since outpaced their warmth. The young woman at the center of it, still unnamed, was the second daughter of that house, raised to a particular kind of life that had been mapped out for her before she was old enough to have any say in the mapping. A suitable marriage, a suitable position in a suitable county, a future that had never once, in all its planning, consulted her about what she herself might have wanted from it. There was, in the account, a cook, not the grand chef such a house might have been expected to keep for its formal dinners, but an older woman who ran the kitchens with a quiet, unshowy authority, and who had, over the years of the young woman's childhood, become the only person in that enormous house who seemed to notice her at all. It was this cook who first put a wooden spoon into the girl's hand, who first showed her how flour and water and warmth and time could become, through nothing more than patience and attention, something alive. The young woman wrote, in a passage Margaret read twice, sitting very still in the worn armchair, with the rain now falling properly outside, that she had understood almost immediately that this was the only true thing she had ever been taught in that whole vast, cold house, that everything else, the deportment and the dancing and the careful arrangement of a face into pleasant blankness, had been a kind of performance, but that bread, when you had learned to read it properly, never lied to you about anything at all. Margaret set the book down for a moment and looked toward the dark bakery beyond the kitchen door, thinking of the copper molds on the shop wall, the birds and sheaves of wheat, and understood, with a small, private ache, that she was reading, however obliquely told, the true beginning of her great-aunt's life, disguised as fiction, perhaps because it had been easier or safer or simply more bearable to set it down that way than to write it as bald fact. She read on. The young woman in the account grew older within its pages, was presented, in due course, to a suitor her family considered entirely satisfactory, a man of good family and better prospects, kind enough in his manner, though the account noted, with a dryness that made Margaret smile despite the weight of what surrounded it, that kindness alone had never yet been enough to make a house feel like anything other than another version of the one she had grown up in. There was an engagement. There was, in the account's telling, a growing dread that the young woman could not fully name even to herself, a sense of a door closing somewhere far off, softly and without drama. On every version of her life she had not been permitted to choose, and there was, arriving into the account almost sideways, as though the writer herself had not quite been ready to give him proper weight, a second man. Not a suitor in the formal sense at all, but the younger son of a neighboring family, a man with no particular fortune of his own and no particular ambition toward one, who had spent, the account said, most of his boyhood roaming the same woods and lanes the young woman had roamed, and who had grown, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, into someone she trusted in a way she had never trusted the man she was engaged to marry. His name, when at last the account gave it, was written plainly, without the softening distance the writer had used for herself. Cassian. Margaret sat up straighter at that. the name settling into place against the memory of the wax paper parcel in the drawer beneath the work table, the single word written under it, in her great-aunt's careful hand. Forgiven. She understood, reading on, that this Cassian must be the same man Fenella had described. So many years later, standing at the cottage door in the evening light, turned away with the kitchen lamp burning behind him, and felt the story tighten around her with the particular gravity of a thing she now knew, however dimly, was going to end in loss. The account did not rush toward that loss. It lingered instead in a series of small and carefully rendered scenes. An afternoon in a walled kitchen garden, the cook teaching the young woman to judge the readiness of a loaf by nothing more than the sound it made when tapped on its base. A summer evening, when Cassian appeared at the kitchen door with a basket of plums from his own family's orchard and stood talking with the cook and the young woman both, until the light went entirely and someone had to be sent to fetch him a lamp to see his way home. There was a tenderness in these pages that Margaret found herself reading slowly, reluctant to move past them too quickly, as though by lingering she might extend, even now, even decades after the fact, some small kindness toward two people who could not, by any means available to her, be helped. The engagement, in the end, could not be avoided, or could not yet be avoided, and it was here, at the close of the third small book, that the account left the young woman standing at the edge of a decision she had not yet made. The wedding date fixed some months hence. Her own heart, by her own admission on the final page, already given elsewhere in Tyre, without her having the smallest idea yet what she meant to do about it. Margaret closed the book and sat for a long while in the dim front room. The rain steady now against the window. The fire she had lit earlier burned down to a soft orange bed of coals, and felt the particular ache of a story paused at exactly its most difficult point. The ache made sharper by her certainty that she already knew, in its broad shape, if not its details, how it must end in a bakery in a Somerset village. A woman alone. A man turned away decades later at a door with the kitchen lamp still burning. She woke the next morning later than she had in days, the light already properly up when she came down, and found, again, the shop already open, the bread already cooling, though she noted, this time, with a fondness she had not expected to feel so soon toward a woman she had never met, that there seemed to be rather more bread than the day's custom was likely to need, as though whatever hand still tended this kitchen in the small hours had known she would want, that morning, to sit a while longer over her tea before beginning the day's proper work. Mrs. Abernathy came by a little after 9, ostensibly to collect her usual order, but plainly, from the particular brightness of her manner, curious to see how Margaret was settling in. She stayed longer than her errand required, perched on a stool by the counter, while Margaret wrapped loaves for the morning's customers, and it was in the course of this visit, offered almost as an aside, that Mrs. Abernathy mentioned something Margaret had not thought to ask about directly. "You'll want to see the old orchard, love, while the light's still good for it," Mrs. Abernathy said, nodding toward the back of the property. Wren kept it lovely in her way, though it's a wild sort of loveliness, not the tidy kind. Plums, mostly. She used to say the trees were older than the cottage, which I never quite believed, but she was particular about them all the same. Wouldn't let anyone touch them but herself, not even Tom Bellamy. And he's handy enough with a saw and a ladder both. Margaret felt something settle into place at the word Plums. A small, quiet click of recognition that she did not explain to Mrs. Abernathy, only thanked her and said she would go and look, and did. That same afternoon, once the shop had closed for the day, walking out through the kitchen door and along a narrow brick path she had not properly explored before, to a walled garden at the rear of the property she had glimpsed only distantly from an upstairs window. The orchard was small, 6 or 7 trees at most, old and gnarled and heavy still with the last of a modest late crop. The grass beneath them left deliberately long and soft, threaded through with the faded remains of summer wildflowers. Margaret stood among the trees for a long while in the slanting afternoon light, thinking of the basket of plums in the account she had read the night before, of a man standing at a kitchen door with fruit from his own family's orchard, and felt, with a suddenness that surprised her, tears rise unbidden and entirely without warning, grief for 2 people she had never known, over a loss that had happened, by any ordinary reckoning, the better part of a lifetime ago. She found, at the base of the oldest tree, half sunk into the soft ground and gone green with age, a small stone marker, no larger than a paving slab, with no name on it at all, only, cut in simple lettering that time had softened but not erased, a single word: waiting. She did not know, standing there in the gathering evening light with the smell of ripe plums heavy and sweet around her, whether the marker commemorated a person or an animal or something else entirely, a private grief given a small and permanent shape in stone. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not feel any pressing need to know immediately. It was enough, for now, to stand among the old trees and let the story she was slowly uncovering settle a little deeper into her, to feel the weight of a life lived fully and privately, and, in its own quiet way, faithfully, long before she herself had ever been born. She returned to the drawer that evening, though she found, once the 4th of the small books was open on her lap in the worn armchair, that her attention kept drifting, pleasantly and without urgency, toward the ordinary small tasks of the day, just past the particular satisfaction of a well-shaped loaf, the little girl who had asked, again, for her extra currant and been given it, away from Tom Bellamy as his van pulled away down the lane. She was beginning, she realized, turning the thought over slowly, as the fire settled and the rain outside finally eased into silence, to feel less like a visitor, cataloguing a stranger's estate, and more like someone quietly, almost without noticing the transition, being handed the keeping of a life. The 4th book took up the story again where the 3rd had left it, the wedding date drawing nearer, the young woman's certainty growing with each passing week that she could not walk willingly into the marriage that had been arranged for her, though the account was honest. In a way Margaret found she respected, about how very difficult it was for the young woman to know what alternative she truly had. There was no version of her family, the account made clear, that would accept a broken engagement lightly, let alone one broken for the sake of a younger son with no fortune and no particular prospects. There was no version of the wider world, in that particular decade, that made it easy for a woman of her position to simply walk away from the life laid out for her and expect to be received anywhere else with anything but scandal trailing close behind. And yet, the account said, in a line Margaret read 3 times before setting the book gently down in her lap, there comes a point in some lives where the cost of staying becomes, without any dramatic moment marking the change, simply higher than the cost of leaving. And a person finds herself, almost without having consciously decided anything at all, already halfway out the door. Margaret sat with that sentence for a long while. The fire burned down now to almost nothing, the cottage entirely quiet around her, and found herself thinking, with an honesty she had not quite permitted herself in some time, of her own flat with its 8 remaining months of lease, of Thomas and his mild, reasonable objections, of the grey carpet tiles and the strip of river visible from exactly one spot by the window, and wondered, not for the first time since arriving in Alderbrook, but for the first time with any real weight behind, the wondering whether she too might already be, in some manner she had not yet properly admitted to herself, halfway out a door of her own. She banked the fire and went up to bed with the small book still open on the arm of the chair, meaning to finish it the following evening, and lay a long while in the dark, listening to the settling sounds of the old cottage around her, thinking of a walled orchard and a stone marked only with a single word, and of a woman, decades gone now, who had once stood exactly where Margaret now stood, at the edge of a life not yet chosen, gathering, with whatever courage the moment required, the strength to choose it anyway. She woke before dawn the next morning, not to the smell of bread this time, but to an ordinary, quiet stillness, and lay for a moment in the dark, trying to place what felt different, before realizing it was simply that she had woken on her own, without the pull of something already stirring below. She went down anyway, from habit now more than necessity, and found the kitchen cool and unlit, the bakery beyond it dark and silent. The first morning since her arrival that nothing at all had been baked in the night. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, oddly unsettled by the absence rather than reassured by it, and then understood, with a small, private smile, that perhaps this was simply what trust looked like, offered back to her in its own quiet way. The sense that she no longer needed, each morning, to be shown how the thing was done. She lit the oven herself for the first time that day, following the rhythm her hands had somehow already learned, and stood watching the first grey light come up over the walled orchard, while the kitchen slowly filled with warmth. Tom Bellamy came by earlier than usual with the week's delivery of flour, and lingered afterward over a cup of tea at the kitchen table in the unhurried way. Margaret was beginning to recognize as simply how things were done in Alderbrook, where an errand was rarely only an errand. "You're settling in, then," he said, not quite a question. "Village is glad of it, if you don't mind my saying. We none of us knew what would happen to the place after. Wondered if it might just close up for good, and that would have been a hard thing to see. This street without the smell of her bread in the morning. I keep finding out more about her than I expected to," Margaret said carefully. "There was a man once, someone called Cassian. Did you ever hear the name?" Tom's face went thoughtful, and he was quiet for a moment, before answering, turning his cup slowly on the table. "Can't say I did, not directly. But I'll tell you something odd, if you'll not think me fanciful for it. Every year, first week of September, regular as the harvest, she'd close the shop for a single day. Wouldn't say why, not to anyone, not in all the years I delivered to her. Just a note in the window, back tomorrow, and the blinds drawn the whole day through. I used to wonder about it, never liked to ask." Margaret felt the small, stone-marked orchard settle differently in her mind at that, the word waiting taking on a shape she had not considered before, and thanked Tom for the thought. turning it over long after he had gone. The flour delivered and stacked, and the van pulling away down the lane toward the next village on his round. She spent the remainder of that day in the ordinary rhythm the bakery now asked of her. And it was not until evening, the shop closed and the light going gold over the high street, that she returned once more to the drawer beneath the work table, drawn back to it now less by curiosity than by something closer to loyalty, a sense that the story deserved to be read through properly, in its own order, by someone who had come, in the space of little more than a week, to care rather more than she had expected to about how it ended. Beneath the small cloth-bound books, tucked into a separate fold of the linen wrapping she had not noticed on her first search of the drawer, she found a slim bundle of letters, tied with the same kitchen string as the wax paper parcels, the paper gone soft and brittle with age, the ink faded to a pale brown that was still unmistakably legible. She did not open them immediately. She sat instead with the bundle resting in her lap, the fire beginning to catch in the grate behind her, and felt the particular weight of standing at the threshold of something that had been folded away, deliberately and for a very long time, from every eye but her great-aunt's own. She thought of the man at the door, turned away with the kitchen lamp still burning. She thought of the single closed day each September, the blinds drawn, the note in the window giving no explanation at all. She thought of the stone beneath the oldest plum tree and the single word cut into it, and understood, holding the letters in her lap in the firelight, with the whole quiet cottage settling into evening around her, that whatever answer they held, she was not yet ready, this first night, to read them all at once. She untied the string with careful fingers and set the letters in order by the dates faintly visible at the top of each page, and read, that evening, only the first of them, slowly, twice, before folding it back exactly as she had found it, and sitting a long while afterward in the firelight, thinking of everything she had learned so far, and everything, still, she had left to learn, in the second half of a story that was no longer. She understood now with a certainty that had crept up on her gradually, over the course of little more than a week, simply her great-aunt's alone to tell. The first letter was dated the second week of September, some 40-odd years past, and was written in a hand Margaret did not recognize, careful and slanted and slightly hurried, as though the writer had composed it in a single sitting and had not trusted himself to slow down for fear of losing his nerve entirely. It began without preamble, as though it were the continuation of a conversation rather than the start of one. You will not see me, and I understand it, though I do not think I will ever fully accept it. Not if I live to be an old man with nothing left to do but accept things. I came to the door because I could not make myself right first, though I see now that was a foolish sort of courage, the kind that costs the other person more than it costs the one who carries it. So I am writing now. Badly, I expect, because it is the only door left open to me. I do not blame you for going. I want you to know that first, before anything else, because I think you have carried the idea of my blame with you all this time, and I cannot bear the thought of you carrying something that was never true. You did the only thing a person in your position could have done, and did it, from everything I have since heard, with more grace than your family deserved from you. I only wish, and this is the whole of my letter really, everything else only trimming around this one wish, that you had let me come with you, or come after, or done anything at all except vanish so completely that it took me the better part of 2 years merely to learn what county you had settled in. I am not writing to ask you to undo anything. I understand, better than you might think, why the answer at the door was no, and why it will likely go on being no for as long as I keep asking. I am writing only so that you will know, whatever else the years bring to either of us, that there is a man not so very far from you who has not for a single day stopped thinking of a walled garden and a basket of plums and the particular sound you taught me to listen for in a well-risen loaf. I will not write again unless you ask me to. But I wanted this much said, at least once, properly, on paper, where it cannot be turned away at a door. Yours, in whatever way you will permit, C. Margaret sat for a long while after reading it. The fire settled to embers, the letter resting light as a leaf in her hands, and found that she had been holding her breath through most of it without noticing. She thought of Fenella's description of the man at the door, the kitchen lamp burning behind Wren, while she sent word through old Mr. Trent that she was not at home, and understood now, with a fresh and sharper ache, exactly how much that closed door must have cost the woman standing behind it. She did not read the second letter that night. She banked the fire properly and climbed the narrow stairs to bed, and lay for a long time in the dark with the ordinary sounds of the old cottage settling around her, thinking not of Wren and Cassian directly, but unexpectedly, and with a discomfort she could not entirely shake, of herself and Thomas, and of the particular ease with which she had allowed 2 years of her own life to arrange itself around his mild, reasonable expectations, never once turning anyone away at a door because she had never, in truth, been asked a question sharp enough to require the courage of an answer. She woke the next morning to find the bakery already lit and busy in its quiet, self-tending way. 3 loaves cooling and a 4th still rising, and stood in the doorway a moment, simply watching the steam curl up into the cool early light, feeling more strongly than she had on any morning since her arrival the particular comfort of being cared for by someone who was no longer there to be thanked for it directly. She opened the shop at 8. The day passed in its familiar small rhythm. Mrs. Prosser for the cottage loaf, the beekeeper for his dark rye, the solemn little girl, whose name Margaret had learned by now, was Alice, for her currant bun, given with the extra currant Margaret had finally learned, by watching her own hands one morning, exactly how to press into the dough just so. She found, doing these small, ordinary things, that the village had stopped treating her as a visitor sometime in the last several days, without her quite marking when the change had happened. Mrs. Prosser asked after her plans for the coming winter, as though there were no question at all that she would still be there to have any. The beekeeper mentioned, in passing, a honey he thought might pair well with a particular loaf come the colder months, speaking of it as a project they might undertake together rather than a suggestion offered to someone soon departing. It was Mrs. Abernathy, calling in again toward the end of the afternoon, who finally asked the question outright, though she asked it gently, over the counter, while Margaret wrapped a loaf of the dark rye in brown paper. "You'll be staying on then," Mrs. Abernathy said, not quite a question, the same way Tom Bellamy's remarks rarely were, but with enough of a lift at the end of it to leave room for Margaret to answer honestly if she chose. Margaret found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not need to think very long before answering. "I think I might be," she said. "I hadn't exactly decided it, but saying it out loud, it doesn't feel like a surprise." Mrs. Abernathy's face broke into a wide, unguarded smile, the kind Margaret had not seen from her before. all her brisk efficiency softening at once into something warmer. Well, I'm glad of it, love, and I'll say no more than that, except that Wren would be glad of it too. Whatever else was between the two of you that neither of us understood. This street wants its bakery. And I think, if you don't mind an old woman saying so, you want it too, whether or not you've quite caught up with yourself on the matter yet. Margaret thought about that remark for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over while she swept the floor and set the day's takings into the old tin box. Wren had apparently used for the purpose for decades, and found that it settled into her not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something she had, in truth, already half decided, somewhere in the quiet mornings of the past week and a half, in the particular satisfaction of watching a loaf rise properly, in the small, current, sticky hand of a solemn little girl, reaching up over the counter, in the warmth of a village that had folded her in with a speed and completeness that her 6 years in London, for all their careful accumulation of routine, had never once managed to offer her. That evening, once the shop was closed and the light had gone its long gold slide toward dusk, she made herself a proper supper for once, rather than the hurried bread and cheese she had been living on, and sat afterward with her tea in the worn armchair, the second of the letters waiting on the small table beside her, and allowed herself, before opening it, a few minutes simply looking around the room at the bookshelf, with its mixture of novels and unmarked ledgers, at the empty grate she had learned, over the past week, exactly how to lay properly, at the particular quality of the evening light coming through the small, deep-set window, and understood that she had, without ever quite deciding to, begun thinking of this room as something closer to home than her flat in London had felt in a very long time. The second letter was dated some 8 months after the first, and was written in a different hand, entirely smaller, rounder. The hand Margaret now recognized without needing to be told as Wren's own, though considerably younger and less certain than the careful, settled writing in the small cloth-bound books. It appeared, from its content, to be a draft rather than a letter actually sent, several lines crossed through and rewritten, as though the writer had composed and abandoned it more than once before, finally setting it, unfinished, into the drawer rather than into the post. I have started this letter 11 times now, and I do not think I will finish it any better on the 12th. So I am simply going to write what is true and let the clumsiness of it stand. Because I think you, of anyone, will forgive me the clumsiness. I did not send you away because I stopped loving you. I want that said plainly, in case nothing else in this letter manages to be plain. I sent you away because I did not yet trust myself to see you and still do the hard, necessary work of becoming a person who was not defined, in every particular, by what my family expected of her. I was so recently out from under all of it, the engagement, the house, the version of myself I had been raised to become, that I was afraid, and I think rightly afraid, that if I let you through that door, I would simply exchange one shape for another, your shape this time instead of theirs. However much kinder and gentler that shape would have been, I needed, for a while, to belong to no one at all, so that whatever I chose afterward, I could be certain I was choosing it, rather than simply falling into it, because it was offered. I do not know, writing this, whether that reasoning will mean anything to you, or whether it will only sound like an excuse dressed up in finer language. I have turned it over so many times these last months that I have lost some ability to judge it fairly. What I know is that I think of you daily in the particular unglamorous way that has nothing to do with longing exactly, and everything to do with simple habit the way I still reach, some mornings, for a second cup at breakfast before remembering there is no one here to share it with. I do not know what I am asking of you, if anything, by writing this at all. Perhaps only that you not think too badly of a woman who is still, some days, learning how to be one, on her own terms, for what feels like the first time in her whole life. The letter ended there, unsigned, the final line trailing into a small ink blot, as though the pen had been set down mid-thought and never lifted again. Margaret read it twice through, and then a third time, more slowly, and found herself, somewhere in the third reading, quietly crying in the worn armchair with the evening gone fully dark outside the small window. Not from sadness exactly, though there was sadness enough folded into the letter's careful, unfinished honesty, but from something closer to recognition, the shock of hearing a private thought she had never spoken to anyone, not even to herself in any words. This clear, given voice by a woman dead 5 months whom she had never once met. She thought of her own flat, and Thomas, and the particular comfortable numbness of a life built entirely around not having to choose anything too sharply, and understood, sitting alone in her great-aunt's front room with an unsent letter in her lap, that she had been, in her own quieter and less dramatic way, doing exactly what Wren had described, belonging so thoroughly to the shape other people expected of her that she had lost, somewhere along the way, any clear sense of what shape she might have chosen for herself, given the chance to choose freely. She did not sleep well that night, though it was not the restlessness of unease this time, so much as the particular wakeful churning of a mind turning over a question it had been avoiding for rather longer than it wanted to admit. She rose before dawn again, as she had on her first mornings in the cottage, and went down to find the oven lit and the first loaves already cooling, and stood for a long while in the quiet kitchen with her tea, watching the light come up slow and grey, and then gold over the walled orchard beyond the window, and thought, with a clarity that arrived all at once, rather than gradually, that she did not, in fact, want to go back to London at all, not to the flat, with its 8 remaining months of lease, not to the firm and its grey carpet tiles, and she allowed herself, finally, to think the thought all the way through, not to Thomas either, not in the shape their 2 years together had settled into, comfortable and low effort, and never once, in all that time, asking of either of them anything sharp enough to require real choosing. She wrote to him that same morning, before she could talk herself into softening it. A letter rather than a message this time, because she thought, having just spent the better part of 2 weeks reading letters written with such careful honesty, that he deserved at least that much care in return. She did not blame him. In the letter, any more than Wren's letter had blamed Cassian. She wrote only that she had found, in the unexpected turn her life had taken, a clarity about what she wanted, that she had not had in some years, and that what she wanted, she now understood, was not the life they had been quietly, comfortably drifting toward together, and that she was sorry, sincerely sorry, for not having found the courage to say so before now, when it might have cost him less to hear it. His reply, when it came 2 days later, was gentler and less mild than she had expected, and contained, buried in its careful, hurt language, an admission that he too had sensed, for longer than either of them had said aloud, that something between them had settled rather than grown, and that perhaps, in the end, this was simply the truth finally being spoken by whichever of them found the courage first. It was not, in the end, the wrenching conversation she had braced herself for. It was, instead, something closer to relief on both sides. A door that had been standing very slightly ajar for a long time, finally allowed to swing fully open. She spent the following days in a strange, light-footed clarity, tending the shop each morning, walking the village lanes each afternoon, reading a little further each evening in the remaining small books and the remaining letters, watching the story of Wren and Cassian unfold alongside the quieter, less dramatic reshaping of her own life, and found the two threads had begun, in her mind, to weave together so closely that she could no longer entirely separate her sympathy for a woman decades gone from the sharpening understanding of her own present choices. The letters that followed, 3 more of them, spanned what appeared, from their dates, to be nearly a decade, growing further apart as the years passed, each one shorter than the last, though no less carefully written. Cassian's second letter, dated some 3 years after his first, mentioned, with a restraint Margaret found more moving than any outright declaration could have been, that he had not married and did not think he would, and that this was not offered as a burden for her to carry, but simply as a fact he thought she ought to know, in case she ever wondered. Wren's answering draft, unsent like the first, spoke of the bakery taking proper shape under her hands at last, of a growing sense of having built, however slowly and however alone, a life that was entirely and only her own, and ended with a line that stayed with Margaret for the rest of that evening. I think I am becoming someone I would have liked to know before all of this. I hope, wherever you are becoming that too. The final letter in the bundle was the shortest of all, dated some 12 years after the first, written in Cassian's hand, and different in tone from everything that had come before it settled, almost peaceful. The urgency of the earlier letters worn down by time into something gentler and more accepting. I think I understand now, finally, what you were doing all those years ago, though it has taken me the better part of my own life to catch up to the understanding. You were not refusing me. You were building yourself, plank by plank, into someone capable of choosing anything at all freely. And I do not think, if I am honest with myself, that the man who came knocking at your door that first September would have known what to do with a woman so entirely her own, however much he loved her. I am glad, from what little I have heard of your bakery and your village, that you found the life you were building toward. I will not write again after this, not because I have stopped thinking of you. I do not imagine I ever will, but because I think this letter, more than any of the others, is finally the right one to end on. Be well. Be exactly as free as you have made yourself. Margaret sat with that final letter for a long while. The fire burned down once more to embers, and understood, closing it and retying the small bundle with its original string, that this was not, in the end, a tragedy in the way she had half expected it to become. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more complete. Two people who had loved each other honestly, and who had each, separately, found a way to become fully themselves, rather than simply folding into the shape the other might have offered, and who had, in the end, made a kind of peace with that separation that had cost them both dearly but had not, in the final accounting, broken either of them. She thought of the stone beneath the oldest plum tree, the single word cut into it, waiting, and understood now, with a certainty she had not had before reading the letters, that it must mark not a person or an animal but something more abstract and more tender than either a private marker for a choice made and, in its own quiet way, honored a small stone tribute to a door that had been closed on purpose and never regretted, even as it was never entirely stopped being mourned. There remained, tucked at the very bottom of the drawer beneath the last of the wax paper parcels, a final small book, thicker than the others, and bound in a deep blue cloth gone soft at the corners with handling, unlike the earlier volumes styled loosely as fiction. Margaret lifted it out on what she understood, without needing to be told, was likely to be the last evening of her reading in that particular quiet ritual, and found, on its opening page, no story dressed as invention at all, but a plain and direct address, written from the steadiness of the hand, considerably later in Wren's life than anything else in the drawer. I am writing this for whoever finds it, though I confess I have a particular someone in mind, more than I probably ought to admit, even to myself. If you are reading this, I expect I am gone, and I expect, given how carefully I have kept this drawer locked all these years, that you have already read the rest of what is here, and so you will understand, better than any stranger could, what I mean when I say that I do not regret the life I chose, even on the days it asked the most of me. I left a family that wanted a particular shape from me, and I did not become that shape, and I know it cost them something, just as it cost me, though I think, in the years since, I have come to believe it cost me rather less than staying would have. I built, here, in this small cottage and this small bakery and this small and generous village, a life that was entirely my own choosing, every loaf and every friendship and every quiet morning of it. And if that life looked smaller from the outside than the one I was meant to have, I can tell you honestly that it never once felt smaller from within it. It felt, most days, like the only life large enough to actually hold the whole of who I was. I do not know who you are, whoever is reading this. I have wondered over the years whether my family kept any memory of me at all, or whether I simply vanished from their accounting the way a name vanishes from a ledger once the account is closed. But I have kept this cottage ready, in whatever way a person can keep readiness folded into brick and flower and habit, on the small chance that someone might one day come looking, whether for the bakery or for the story, or simply for an answer to a question they had not yet learned to ask. If that someone is you, I hope you will forgive an old woman one piece of advice, offered freely and without any real right to give it. Do not wait, as long as I did, to become entirely your own. I do not regret my life, but I regret some quiet nights, how many years it took me to stop being afraid of it. Whatever you choose to do with this cottage, know that it was given freely, without any expectation attached beyond the simple hope that it might, in some small way, become for you what it became for me. A place large enough to hold a whole life. A place where the door, whenever you are ready to open it, will always be exactly as wide as you need it to be. With more love than I ever found the words to send while I was living. W. Margaret closed the book slowly and sat for a long while in the quiet, firelit room, the whole weight of the last 2 weeks settling at last into something she could hold steadily rather than turn over piece by piece. She thought of her mother's voice on the telephone. "We don't talk about Wren," and understood now that this silence had likely been less about scandal than about a family's inability to forgive a woman for wanting something other than what they had planned for her. A silence passed down, not out of malice so much as out of habit. The same habit, perhaps, that had nearly kept Margaret herself folded into a shape she had not chosen, until an unexpected letter had arrived on an ordinary Wednesday and asked her, without quite meaning to, the same question Wren had once asked herself in a walled kitchen garden decades before. She rose, eventually, and banked the fire, and carried the blue book carefully upstairs with her, rather than returning it to the drawer, setting it on the small table beside her bed where she would be able to reach for it easily in the mornings that followed, the way, she thought, a person keeps close whatever has finally taught them something true. She slept deeply that night, for the first time in some days, and woke before dawn not from restlessness, but from the same quiet, contented alertness with which she had begun to wake each morning in the cottage, and went down to find the bakery, as it so often was now, already softly alive with warmth, and stood for a long moment in the doorway, simply breathing it, in the flour, the faint sweetness beneath it, the particular gold quality of the very earliest light coming through the bow window before beginning, with hands that no longer felt borrowed but entirely and finally her own. The day's quiet and familiar work there was, in the days immediately following her reading of the Blue Book, a period of quiet adjustment that Margaret would later think of as the hinge on which the whole of her new life had gently turned. She did not rush toward any of the decisions that followed. She found, instead, that they arrived one at a time, in their own unhurried order, each one settling into place with a kind of inevitability that made the deciding feel less like choosing and more like simply noticing what had already been true for some time. She went first to see Fenella, carrying the small bundle of letters with her, and sat in the cluttered front room with its pressed flowers and its china figures, and read the letters aloud, slowly, while the old woman listened with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, occasionally murmuring some small sound of recognition, as though certain details confirmed things she had long suspected but never had proof of. "I knew there was more to that man at the door than a simple quarrel," Fenella said. Once Margaret had finished, wiping carefully at her eyes with a handkerchief she had produced from her sleeve well before the reading was done. "I told you as much myself, if you recall, but I never imagined the whole of it went so deep or lasted so long. 40 years, and she never once mentioned him by name, not to me, not in all our years of tea and gossip and every other confidence two old women share. She carried that alone the whole time." She was quiet for a moment, looking toward the window and the grey autumn garden beyond it. "I think I understand her rather better now than I did when she was alive to be understood. Isn't that a strange thing? To come to know your dearest friend more fully only after she's gone." "I feel that too," Margaret admitted. "About her, and I think, in a way, about myself as well. Reading her letters taught me something about my own life I hadn't let myself see clearly before." Fenella reached over and patted her hand with the light, papery touch of the very old, her sharp eyes softening. "Then she's given you 2 gifts instead of 1, hasn't she? The cottage and the courage to properly live in it. That sounds like Wren." if I ever knew her at all. She was never a woman to give a thing without also giving you the means to use it well. Margaret's letter to her mother, when she finally sat down to write it properly, rather than merely drafting it in her head during the long, quiet evenings, took her 3 attempts before she was satisfied. And even then she posted it with a degree of uncertainty about how it would be received, given how unreliably her mother's memory now moved between clarity and fog. She wrote plainly about the cottage and the bakery and the village, about the letters and the orchard and the small stone marked waiting. And she wrote, toward the end, as gently as she knew how, that she understood now why the family had perhaps found it easier to fold Wren's memory away into silence than to sit with the harder truth of what her leaving had actually meant, and that she hoped whatever fragments of clarity remained to her mother in the months and years ahead, there might be room among them for something closer to forgiveness than the family had managed to offer while Wren was still alive to receive it. Her mother's reply came by telephone rather than by letter, a call placed on one of her clearer days, her voice steadier and more present than Margaret had heard it in some time, as though the act of remembering Wren properly, at last, had cleared some small space in her mind for the remembering to happen. I was too young to understand it when it happened, her mother said, her voice thin but clear down the line. I only knew that we didn't speak her name anymore, and that this was somehow a family rule, the way you learn as a child, that some doors in a house are simply not for opening, without ever being told exactly why. I think, now that you've told me all this, I understand for the first time what we lost by keeping that door shut for so long. I'm glad you opened it, love. I'm glad one of us finally did. They spoke for the better part of an hour, longer than any conversation Margaret could recall having with her mother in several years, the fog lifting further the longer they talked, old fragments of memory surfacing unexpectedly, a photograph she recalled having once seen and never been told the name of the woman in it, a comment her own grandmother had once made, bitter and unexplained at the time, about a daughter too proud to know what was good for her. Margaret wrote it all down afterward at the kitchen table, adding what she learned to her own, slowly growing understanding of the family's silence, and felt, doing so, that she was not merely uncovering a story, but actively mending something that had been left torn for far longer than anyone still living could properly account for. The season turned properly toward autumn in the weeks that followed, the high street losing its last green edges to gold, and then to the bare, clean lines of the coming winter, and Margaret found her days filling not only with the bakery's steady rhythm, but with the small accumulating textures of a life properly rooted in one place. She learned from the beekeeper, whose name she finally troubled herself to ask, and learned was Edwin, the particular art of pairing a autumn honey with a dark, dense loaf that became, within a few weeks of its introduction, one of the shop's most requested items, sold out most mornings before 10. She learned, from Tom Bellamy, the names of the surrounding villages on his delivery round, and began, on the quieter afternoons, to accompany him occasionally, delivering bread herself to farms and cottages tucked away down lanes she would never otherwise have found. Each visit adding some new face and some new fragment of the wider community she had, almost without noticing, become a genuine part of, she found herself, one grey November afternoon, standing again at the base of the oldest plum tree in the walled orchard, the small stone marked waiting cold beneath her fingers, where she had crouched to brush away a scattering of fallen leaves, and understood, with a clarity that arrived gently, rather than as any sudden revelation, that she wanted to give the marker a companion. She spoke to a stonemason in the next village over, a quiet, careful man, who listened to her explanation with more patience than the small request perhaps warranted, and commissioned a second stone, smaller than the first, to be set beside it, carrying a single word of her own choosing, chosen. She set it herself on a cold, bright morning in early December, kneeling in the frost-hardened grass beneath the bare branches of the old tree, and sat for a long while afterward with her bare hands resting on the cold stone, thinking of a woman who had waited a lifetime for a choice she had already, in every way that mattered, made the moment she walked away from that grand cold house in the north, and thinking, too, of her own choosing, quieter and less dramatic perhaps, but no less real for its quietness, a flat given up, a comfortable and low-effort love allowed to end honestly. A whole different life declined in favor of this one, cold-fingered and frost-bright and entirely her own. Christmas came to Alderbrook with a particular unhurried warmth Margaret had not experienced in London, where the season had always felt, in her working years, like something to be endured and managed rather than properly inhabited. The village green filled on the shortest afternoon of the year, with a gathering the whole community turned out for. Carol singers grouped loosely beneath the horse chestnut tree, its bare branches strung with small lights that someone climbed a ladder each year to arrange. Mulled wine passed in enamel mugs from a trestle table. Mrs. Abernathy organized with brisk, cheerful authority. Margaret brought trays of small spiced buns from the bakery. A recipe she had found, tucked among Wren's other papers, marked simply midwinter, and watched them disappear within minutes into the cold, delighted hands of children who called her by name now without any hesitation at all, as though she had always belonged here, as though the 11 days of uncertainty in London that had preceded her arrival had never happened at all, or had happened to someone else entirely, some earlier and less complete version of herself she no longer entirely recognized. She wrote to Thomas once more, that winter, a brief and easy note rather than anything heavy, wishing him well for the season, and received back a similarly easy reply, warm in its own way, free of any lingering weight. Two people who had once shared a comfortable, low-effort life, now, simply, and without rancor, moving on into whatever shape their separate futures were to take. She thought of him rarely, and without any particular pain when she did, only a mild, distant fondness for a chapter of her life that had, in the end, quietly and without drama, simply closed, the way a door closes when a house no longer has any use for the room behind it. It was in January, the bakery quiet in the particular hush that settles over a village once the festive season has passed, that Margaret finally returned to the drawer beneath the work table one final time, meaning only to return the letters to their proper place among the other papers, and found, tucked into a corner of the drawer she had not fully explored on her earlier searches, a final small folded note, considerably more recent than anything else the drawer contained. The paper crisp rather than yellowed, the ink dark and fresh, in a way that told her immediately it had been written not decades ago, but in the final months of Wren's own life. She unfolded it carefully, her heart moving a little faster than the moment perhaps required, and read in a hand grown shakier with age, but no less careful for the shaking. A message clearly meant for whoever eventually found their way to this final corner of the drawer. If you are reading this, you have likely already read everything else, and I expect, if you are anything like the person I have found myself hoping you might be, that you have made your peace with all of it by now, in whatever way makes sense to you. I want to tell you one last thing, since I find, in these final months, that I have a great deal more I wish I had said sooner to a great many people, and precious little time left in which to say any of it. I wrote to Cassian near the end. One final letter, after his own last one, though I did not send it either. In the end, the same old habit of caution outliving whatever use it once had. I will not copy it out here in full, only tell you what it said, in case it matters to whoever you are. I told him that I had, in fact, become the woman I set out to become, that I did not regret a single year of it, and that if there was any small unfinished sorrow left in me after all this time, it was only that I had never found the courage to tell him so directly, while there was still a chance either of us might have done something about it. I do not know if he is living still, wherever he settled all those years ago. I did not have the courage, even at the very end, to find out. Perhaps that is a task I am leaving, without quite meaning to you. I do not ask it of you. But if you find yourself curious, and if the finding of him seems to matter more to you than the not knowing, I think you have my blessing to look, though I confess I am not entirely certain, even now, what I hope you might find. Whatever you decide, know that I have loved this life fully, door and drawer and orchard and all, and that I have loved, in whatever quiet way, an old woman locked away in a bakery can love someone she has never met. The thought of you finding your way here, eventually, and making of it whatever you needed it to become. Margaret sat with the note for a long time in the cold January afternoon light, and found herself, over the following weeks, turning the question over slowly and without any particular urgency, unsure at first whether she wanted to pursue it at all, whether some stories were better left resting exactly where their tellers had chosen to leave them. But curiosity, and something gentler and more purposeful than curiosity, won out in the end, and she wrote carefully to the one address she found among Wren's old papers that seemed connected to Cassian's family, a manor house in the north whose name appeared faintly in the margin of one of the earliest small books. The reply, when it came some weeks later, was written not by Cassian himself, but by a grandniece of his, a woman named Charlotte, who explained, gently and with evident care for how the news might land, that Cassian had died some 6 years prior, in his own quiet way content, having lived a long life that included, in its final decades, a modest and much-loved orchard of his own, planted, he had told his family more than once, without ever fully explaining why, in memory of someone he had known a very long time ago. Charlotte enclosed, with her letter, a single photograph, an elderly man standing among fruit trees in late golden light, his face lined and kind, and, tucked into the photograph's corner, almost too small to notice at first, a small stone marker at the base of the nearest tree, its inscription too distant and worn to read clearly in the photograph. But there all the same, unmistakably there. Margaret wrote back to Charlotte with her thanks, and included, though she debated for some time whether it was right to do so, a brief account of Wren's own orchard and its matching stone, and received, in turn, a warm and grateful reply. The beginning of what would become, over the following years, an easy and occasional correspondence between two women who had never met but who had come, each in her own way, to understand that they were tending, on opposite ends of the country, the quiet, final chapter of the same old story. She did not weep, reading Charlotte's first letter, though she had expected she might. She felt instead something closer to a settling, a sense of a circle finally closing gently rather than being forced shut. Two orchards planted in memory of the same lost afternoon. Two old people who had each, in their own separate and private ways, honored a love neither of them had been able to keep, and neither of them, in the end, had truly regretted choosing to set aside in favor of becoming, fully and freely, themselves. The weeks that followed settled into a life Margaret had not planned for and had not, until she was already living inside it, understood how completely she wanted. She gave notice on the flat in London and drove up one final time with a hired van to collect the handful of things she cared enough to keep, surprised at how little, in the end, there turned out to be. She wrote properly to Mr. Pargeter about the transfer of the business into her own name, and to her mother, gently, about what she had learned, though she found, in the writing, that she did not press for explanations her mother's fading memory could no longer reliably supply, choosing instead simply to say that she had come to know Wren in her own way, and had come to love her for it, and hoped her mother might, in whatever clear moments remained to her, find it in herself to do the same. Alice, the solemn little girl with the currant bun, became a familiar fixture at the counter each morning. And it was Alice, in fact, standing on her toes to see over the edge of the work table one grey October morning, who asked Margaret, with the plain directness only children manage without cruelty, whether she was going to stay forever now, the way Wren always had. Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, setting down the dough she had been shaping, and found the answer arrived without any hesitation at all. "I think I am," she said. "I think this is exactly where I'm meant to be." Spring came slowly to Alderbrook, in the particular unhurried way of a season that seemed to know it had no need to rush. The hedgerows along the lane thickening first with a pale green haze that deepened by degrees into the full green Margaret remembered from her arrival the previous autumn. The walled orchard filling once more with blossom, white and faintly pink. Humming with the early bees, Edwin kept a careful, proprietary eye on from his own garden, 2 lanes over. Margaret found herself, that first full spring, walking out to the orchard more often than the season strictly required, not from any particular task, but simply for the pleasure of standing among the blossoming trees with the 2 small stones at her feet, watching the light move through branches heavy with 100 years of quiet, faithful blooming. It was on one of these unhurried spring mornings, walking back from the orchard with her hands still smelling faintly of the crushed grass beneath the trees, that she met, properly for the first time, a man named Daniel Ashworth, who had recently taken over the running of the small joinery 2 doors along from the ironmonger's, and who had been, she learned over the following weeks, in the easy, gradual way such things become known in a village of Alderbrook size, quietly and without any great drama, repairing the shop's old bow window frame, which had needed attention for some years and which Wren, by all accounts, had simply never gotten around to having properly seen to. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident. Over a length of timber, he had brought round one grey Tuesday morning to measure against the window's old, slightly warped frame, and it was Margaret, rather to her own surprise, who extended the conversation past its practical necessity, asking him what had brought him to Alderbrook, a question she had, by now, been asked so many times herself that she had begun to understand it as the village's particular way of properly welcoming a newcomer into its fold. Daniel answered easily, without any great weight behind it, that he had grown up 2 villages over, and had simply wanted, after some years working in a larger workshop in Bath, to come home to something smaller and slower, a decision she recognized, listening to him describe it as its own quiet version of the same choosing she and Wren. And even, in his own way, Cassian had each made in their turn a decision to build a life around what actually mattered, rather than what seemed, from the outside, most impressive or most expected. Their friendship grew slowly over the following months, in the unhurried way of 2 people who had each, in their different ways, learned the value of not rushing toward anything before its proper season, a shared cup of tea after the window was finally set right, an occasional evening at the village pub where half the conversation, inevitably, involved someone else's business rather than their own. A quiet, easy comfort that Margaret found, examining it honestly, was entirely unlike the comfortable low effort of her years with Thomas, closer, instead, to something she recognized, with a small private smile, from the careful, patient courtship described in Wren's own early letters. Not a settling, but a slow and deliberate building. 2 people choosing each other, freshly, in small ways, again and again. Rather than simply drifting into an arrangement neither had properly examined. She did not rush this either. She had learned, if nothing else, from the whole long unfolding of Wren's story and her own, the particular value of allowing a thing to take exactly the time it needed to become fully and honestly itself, and so she let the friendship with Daniel grow at its own unhurried pace through that spring and into the following summer, content, for now, simply to notice how much lighter and more entirely her own the days felt when she allowed herself the patience such growing required. The bakery itself continued its steady work through all of this. The ovens lit each dawn, the shelves filled and emptied and filled again, the particular rhythm of the place settling ever more completely into Margaret's own hands until she could no longer entirely say where Wren's remembered habits ended and her own instincts began, the 2 having woven together over the better part of a year into something that felt, at last, entirely seamless. She introduced, that first summer, a few small recipes of her own, devising careful, modest additions to a menu that had stood largely unchanged for decades, and found the village received them with the same warm, generous welcome it had extended to her from her very first morning. Proof, if she had needed any, that she was not merely tending a dead woman's legacy but building, loaf by loaf and season by season, something that was genuinely and increasingly her own. She thought, often in those months, of the Blue Book's final message, of Wren's plain admission that she did not regret her life, but regretted, on certain quiet nights, how long it had taken her to stop being afraid of it, and found in that admission a kind of gentle instruction she tried, in her own quieter way, to honor She did not wait. When the moment came the following autumn, almost exactly a year after her first arrival in Alderbrook, for Daniel to ask the question that had been building slowly between them all that patient year. She asked it herself, over a simple supper in the cottage kitchen, with the last of the season's plums set out in a bowl between them, whether he might like, properly and without any hurry, but also without any further waiting, to see where this quiet, unhurried thing between them might grow, if given the proper room to do so. He said yes, in the easy, unshowy way that had come to characterize nearly everything about him, and reached across the table to take her flour-dusted hand in his, and Margaret felt, in that small, ordinary gesture, the particular satisfaction of a choice made cleanly and without any of the fear that had once, by her great-aunt's own admission, taken decades to properly set down. She kept, as the year turned toward winter, Wren's tradition of the single closed day each September, though she moved it, in the years that followed, to a date of her own choosing that held its own private meaning, and spent that day each year walking out to the walled orchard, tending quietly to the old plum trees, and sitting a while beside the small stone marked only with a single word, thinking of two people who had loved each other honestly and chosen, in the end, to become fully themselves rather than fold into any shape not entirely their own, and grateful, in a way she found she could never quite put into ordinary words, that their choosing had somehow, across all the years and all the silence, found its way to her. Her mother came to visit that second autumn, a journey Margaret had not been at all certain her mother's health would permit, arranged carefully with a nurse traveling alongside her for the length of the train journey and the days that followed. Margaret met them both at the station in the next town over, and drove her mother slowly along the narrowing lanes toward Alderbrook, watching her mother's face in the mirror the whole way, uncertain what to expect from a mind that moved now so unpredictably between clarity and fog. But her mother, stepping out of the car in front of the cottage, stood very still for a long moment, looking up at the pale gold stone and the faded gilt lettering above the bakery door, and said, in a voice that seemed to arrive from somewhere unexpectedly clear and present, "I remember this. Not the place itself, I never came here, but the feeling of it. My own mother used to go very quiet and strange whenever anyone mentioned Somerset, and I never understood why until you wrote to me." She turned to look at Margaret, her eyes damp but steady. "Thank you for opening that door, love. I don't know how many more clear days I've got left in me, but I'm glad this is one of them, and I'm glad I got to spend it here." Margaret walked her mother slowly through the cottage and the bakery, and out, finally, to the walled orchard, where her mother stood a long while before the two small stones at the base of the oldest tree, reading their single carved words with a careful, searching attention, before saying, quietly, almost to herself, "Waiting. Chosen. She got there in the end, didn't she? It just took her a good deal longer than it ought to have, because none of us would open the door for her while she was still here to walk through it." They sat together afterward at the kitchen table, 3 generations of a family's silence. Finally, gently, being unwound over tea and a plate of the small spiced buns Margaret had learned to make from Wren's own recipe, and her mother spoke, more freely than Margaret had heard her speak in years, about fragments of memory that had apparently been resurfacing steadily in the months since Margaret's letters had first reached her, a photograph glimpsed once as a child and never explained, an aunt's bitter remark overheard through a closed door. The particular quality of silence that had always seemed to settle over any family gathering where, for reasons no one present ever named, a chair sat conspicuously and permanently empty. "I wish I'd known her mother said, toward the end of the visit, watching the last of the afternoon light move slowly across the orchard grass. "I wish someone had had the courage to open that door a good deal sooner than you did. But I suppose it doesn't do to dwell too long on the doors we didn't open in time. Better, I think, to be glad of the one that finally did get opened, and by the right person, in the right season, even if it came later than any of us would have wished." Margaret thought of that visit often in the months that followed, turning her mother's words over alongside Wren's own final message in the Blue Book, and found in them a kind of matching wisdom, the same lesson arriving from two different women across two different lifetimes that regret, when it came, was better spent noticing the doors still open ahead than mourning too long over the ones left closed behind. The 2nd September came, and with it, Margaret's own version of the tradition Wren had kept for 40 years. The shop closed for a single day, the blinds drawn, though she chose, in the end, not to keep the day entirely silent and private the way her great-aunt had. She invited Daniel to walk with her out to the orchard that morning, and told him, for the first time in full, the whole of the story the drawer beneath the work table had slowly given up to her over the course of a single long autumn the year before the letters. The unsent replies, the stone marked waiting, and the stone she had set beside it marked chosen, the correspondence with Charlotte that continued, still, warm and occasional, a thread connecting two orchards and two families who had each, in their own way, finally learned to speak the name that had once been kept so carefully silent. Daniel listened without interrupting, sitting beside her in the long grass beneath the old trees, and when she had finished, he took her hand in his, quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I think," he said, "that's the finest inheritance I've ever heard of. Not the cottage, not the bakery, though those are fine things too. The rest of it, the courage of it, passed down the way some families pass down silence instead." He looked at her, his expression open and unguarded in the particular way she had come to love most about him. "I'm glad you found it, and gladder still that you let it change you the way it seems to have done." Margaret sat with him a long while in the warm September light. The smell of the last ripening plums, heavy and sweet around them, the two small stones cool and solid beneath her fingers, where she had rested her free hand against them, and felt, more completely than she had felt at any point since that ordinary Wednesday in London, when the cream-colored envelope had first arrived on her desk, entirely and gratefully at home. The bakery on Mill Lane kept its lamps lit warm each morning long before the rest of the village stirred. The ovens kindled not by any hand that needed explaining, but simply by whatever quiet, patient current had always tended that particular kitchen, passed now, as it had been passed to Wren before her, into hands that had finally, fully learned to trust it. And if, on certain still mornings, the smell of a particular bread drifted down Mill Lane before the shop had properly opened its doors, warm and faintly sweet, with something like memory folded into it, the village had long since stopped wondering at it, and simply, gratefully, breathed it in. There came, in the 3rd spring of Margaret's life in Alderbrook, a morning much like any other, grey giving slowly over to gold, the oven's warmth filling the small kitchen, when she found herself standing exactly where she had stood on that very first disorienting morning, in the doorway between the kitchen and the bakery, looking at 4 loaves cooling on their rack in the early light. She was struck, standing there, by how entirely the fear of that first morning had transformed, over the slow accumulation of ordinary days, into something closer to reverence. The strangeness she had once found so unsettling now, simply the accustomed, beloved shape of her own daily life. She thought, in that quiet moment, of all the women who had stood in this exact spot before her, tending this exact warmth, and understood herself now as only the latest in a long, unbroken line of quiet keeping Wren before her. And before Wren, whatever hands had first taught her the trade in that cold northern kitchen, and before that, further back than any single story could properly trace, the whole long chain of women who had learned, each in her own time and her own place, that a life built with patient, honest hands could hold more truth and more freedom than any grander shape imposed from outside ever could. She set the morning's bread out onto the shop shelves as the sun cleared the rooftops opposite, and turned the sign in the window from closed to open, and stood for a moment in the doorway, breathing in the cool spring air, watching the high street slowly wake around her. Mrs. Abernathy sweeping her own step 2 doors down, Tom Bellamy's van turning the corner by the green, Alice, taller now by a full head than she had been that first autumn, walking hand in hand with her mother toward the shop door, with the particular eager hurry of a child who knows exactly which bun she means to ask for. Margaret smiled and stepped back behind the counter, and began, as she did every morning now without any hesitation at all, the quiet and entirely her own work of the day ahead. Later that same spring, a letter arrived from Charlotte, the first in some months, carrying news that she had, at last, gathered the courage to visit Cassian's old orchard properly herself, rather than simply tending it from a polite family distance, as she had done for years, out of a sense of duty rather than true understanding. She wrote that she had sat a long while beside the small stone marker there, and had found herself, unexpectedly, moved to tears by a story that was not, strictly speaking, her own to grieve, and had decided, in the sitting, to plant a further tree of her own alongside the old ones, in honor of a devotion she had come to properly understand only through Margaret's letters. She asked, gently, whether Margaret might one day be willing to visit, to see the northern orchard for herself, to stand where Cassian had stood and complete, in some small way, a circle that had taken the better part of a century to close. Margaret read the letter at the kitchen table with her tea going cold beside her, and felt the familiar, welcome ache of a story still quietly unfolding, even now, years after she had first found it locked away in a drawer beneath a bakery worktable, and understood that she would, in fact, go when the season was right, and stand in that northern orchard the way she had once stood in her own, and carry back with her whatever small further piece of the story remained still to be gathered, not out of any obligation, but out of the same patient, grateful devotion that had, in the end, remade her entire life. She wrote back that same evening, saying yes, and set the letter aside to post in the morning, and went out, before the light fully faded, to walk once more among her own orchard's old trees, the 2 small stones cool beneath the darkening sky, and thought, standing there in the gathering dusk, with the whole quiet village settling into evening around her, that some stories, properly tended, never really finish closing at all. They simply keep opening, gently and in their own good time, into rooms larger and warmer than anyone standing at their beginning could ever have quite imagined. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story helped carry you towards sleep, know that there will be another quiet place waiting for you next time. Rest well, and good night.